Young actor mocks an old man at an audition, then realizes it's Morgan Freeman. "You're in the wrong place, old man." The words slice through the quiet murmur of the waiting room, loud enough for everyone to hear but laced with just enough casual disdain to seem like an offhand remark. A few heads turned, some with mild curiosity, others with quiet disapproval, but most people kept their eyes on their scripts, focusing on the lines they had memorized and the roles they were desperate to land. Jason Cole smirked to himself. He had always believed confidence was the key to success in Hollywood. At just 25, he was already gaining traction. A few minor roles in indie films, a social media following large enough to make directors take notice, and an agent who assured him that he was going to be the next big thing. And tonight's audition? This was his moment. The lead role in a major studio film, a part that would cement his rise to stardom. So, when he spotted the old man sitting quietly in the corner, he couldn't help but feel annoyed. Jason had expected to compete against other young, ambitious actors like himself, not against some washed-up relic from a bygone era. He turned to his group of friends, other aspiring actors just as hungry as him, and leaned in, making sure his voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Seriously, what is he even doing here? Hollywood's not a retirement home, man." A few chuckles rippled through the group. The old man didn't react. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his lap, posture relaxed. There was no hint of tension, no sign of offense taken, which only made Jason more irritated. Was he ignoring him? Did he not hear? Or worse, was he so far past his prime that he just didn't care anymore? Jason scoffed. Some people just don't know when to quit. The words were cruel, blunt, and they hung in the air longer than Jason had intended, because this time the old man lifted his gaze. For the first time, Jason locked eyes with him, and suddenly something felt off. The man's stare was calm, too calm. His eyes carried something Jason couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, it wasn't embarrassment. It was something else entirely. Like amusement, like he was watching a child throw a tantrum, knowing exactly how this would end. Jason shifted uncomfortably, but quickly covered it with another smirk. "What, no comeback?" he pressed, arms crossed. "Guess I was right then. Your time's up." The man just smiled, a small, knowing smile. Jason didn't know why, but it made his stomach twist just slightly. A woman nearby, a young actress reviewing her lines, suddenly froze as she looked at the old man. Her eyes widened, mouth slightly open in recognition. She turned to her friend, whispering urgently. Jason caught a few words. "Oh my God, is that—" But before she could finish her sentence, the casting director stepped into the room. "Jason Cole, you're up next." Jason straightened his shoulders, brushing off whatever unease had started creeping into his chest. This was his moment, his chance to prove himself. With one last glance at the old man, he flashed a cocky grin and walked into the audition room, completely unaware that he had just insulted one of the greatest actors of all time. And what happened next? It would be a lesson he would never forget. Is talent enough to succeed, or does character matter more? Comment 1 for character, 0 for talent. Jason Cole had always believed that confidence was the most important trait an actor could have. At just 25 years old, he had already convinced himself that he was on the fast track to stardom. A few minor roles, thousands of social media followers, and an agent who constantly reassured him that he was the next big thing had been enough to inflate his ego to dangerous levels. And tonight was supposed to be the night he proved it to the world. The audition he was waiting for wasn't just any casting call. It was for a major studio film, the kind of movie that could launch a career into the stratosphere. This wasn't about small-budget projects or streaming series. This was a big-budget, Hollywood-backed blockbuster. And Jason was convinced he was going to land the lead role. As he sat in the waiting area of the casting office, surrounded by other hopefuls clutching their scripts, Jason felt nothing but confidence. The other actors in the room? They weren't competition. They were just background noise. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes scan the room, taking in the hopeful expressions of those around him. Some were practicing their lines quietly, others were pacing nervously, mumbling monologues under their breath. And then he saw him. In the far corner of the room sat an old man, his hands folded neatly in his lap, posture relaxed. His attire was simple, a well-worn blazer, dark slacks, and a pair of shoes that had clearly seen better days. Jason frowned. Something about him seemed out of place. Most of the actors in the room were in their 20s or early 30s, all fresh-faced, eager, and hungry for fame. But this guy? He was old. Jason smirked, nudging the actor next to him, a friend he had met at another audition. "Hey, check this out," he whispered, nodding toward the old man. "Think he wandered into the wrong place?" The friend chuckled. "Yeah, man, Hollywood's no place for dinosaurs." Jason grinned. "Bet he thinks he's still got a shot. Sad, really." A few others overheard the conversation and snickered. The energy in the room shifted slightly. Jason was commanding attention, and he loved it. But the old man? He didn't react, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Jason expected some kind of response, a side glance, a raised eyebrow, a muttered insult back. But instead, the old man just sat there, calm as ever, as if Jason's words didn't even reach him. And for some reason, that irritated Jason. "Some people just don't know when to quit," he said louder this time, making sure the entire room heard him. And finally, the old man looked up. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Jason met his eyes and felt something he hadn't expected, a shift. There was no anger in those eyes, no offense taken, just amusement. Like the old man had seen this before, like he already knew how this would end. Jason felt a flicker of discomfort, but he pushed it aside. No way was he going to be rattled by some nobody. "What, no comeback?" Jason pressed, crossing his arms. "Guess I was right. Hollywood's no place for old men." The old man smiled, a small, knowing smile. Jason felt something tighten in his chest. Something about that expression made him uneasy. Across the room, a young actress, flipping through her script, suddenly froze as she looked up. Her eyes widened. She turned to the person next to her, whispering urgently. Jason only caught a few words. "Oh my God, is that—" But before she could finish, the casting director stepped into the room. "Jason Cole, you're up next." Jason exhaled, shaking off whatever strange feeling had started creeping into his gut. This was his moment, his chance to prove himself. He shot one last glance at the old man, whose expression hadn't changed, that frustratingly calm, knowing smile still in place. Jason flashed his signature cocky grin and walked into the audition room, completely unaware that he had just insulted one of the greatest actors of all time. The moment that would destroy his confidence. Jason thought this was just another audition, just another opportunity to show off his talent. But what happened next would be a lesson he would never forget. Jason walked into the audition room with his usual swagger, exuding the kind of overconfidence that came from never having faced real failure. He had rehearsed for this moment for weeks, visualizing exactly how it would play out. He would walk in, flash his million-dollar smirk, and deliver a performance so electrifying that the casting directors would have no choice but to give him the role. His agent had told him this was it, the breakthrough he had been waiting for, and in Jason's mind, it was already his. But then, he saw the panel. His breath caught. The arrogance in his expression cracked, just slightly. Seated in the center of the judging panel, script in hand, was the old man from the waiting room. Jason's entire body went cold. This couldn't be real. There was no way. And yet, there he was. Not just sitting among the casting judges, but at the very center of the table, flipping through the script with a calm, practiced ease, as if he had been in this exact position 1,000 times before. Jason swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how small the room felt. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. His hands, which were always steady, felt clammy. He forced himself to look away from the old man and focused on the other panelists. To his left was James Horner, a seasoned director with an Oscar nomination under his belt. Next to him was Olivia Reed, the producer behind two of the year's biggest box office hits. And then, of course, Morgan Freeman. Jason felt his heartbeat pound in his ears. His throat was dry. How had he not recognized him? How had he mocked him, insulted him in front of an entire room of actors? And more importantly, how was he supposed to audition in front of him now? The air in the room felt different now. It was as if the weight of Freeman's presence had shifted everything. The confidence Jason had carried in with him had been completely replaced by something else. Something unnerving, guilt, regret, and most of all, fear. He could feel the eyes of the panel on him, waiting for him to begin. Jason took a shaky breath and tried to gather himself. "You ready, son?" The voice was smooth, deep, iconic. The kind of voice that could command an entire audience with a whisper. Jason forced himself to look up, only to see Morgan Freeman staring at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. He was smiling, just slightly. Jason's stomach twisted. He knew, of course he knew. Jason managed to nod. "Yeah, I'm ready." He wasn't, but he didn't have a choice. He launched into his monologue, trying to shake the weight of what had just happened, but something was off. His voice, normally full of conviction, felt hollow. His delivery, something he had always prided himself on, was stiff, forced. The rhythm of his speech was unnatural. His hands, which were always perfectly timed for gestures, now felt awkward. And worst of all, he forgot his lines. It had never happened before. Not in an audition, not in rehearsals. Jason tried to recover, but his mind was blank. He had practiced this script hundreds of times. He knew it backward and forward. And yet, in front of Morgan Freeman, with the weight of his own arrogance crushing down on him, Jason choked. The silence stretched. A painful, suffocating silence. The other judges exchanged glances. James Horner raised an eyebrow. Olivia Reed tapped her pen against her notepad, looking disinterested. But Freeman, he was just watching. Not judging, not mocking, just watching, waiting, and that made it so much worse. Jason's mouth felt like sandpaper. His entire body was tense. He forced out a line, but it sounded flat, emotionless, wrong. He knew it. And worse, they knew it too. This was supposed to be his moment, and he had ruined it. The monologue ended. Jason exhaled shakily, wiping the sweat from his palms onto his jeans. The silence in the room stretched on too long. He could feel the rejection before anyone even spoke. He had failed, and he knew it. Freeman set his script down, studying Jason for a long moment. Jason swallowed hard, bracing himself for whatever came next. And then finally, Freeman spoke. "Acting isn't just about talent, son," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "It's about presence, character, the way you hold yourself, not just in front of the camera, but when you think no one important is watching." Jason felt the words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. His breath was uneven, his stomach twisted. The silence in the room stretched. Freeman leaned back, fingers laced together. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Jason could barely nod. He did. He understood all too well. Freeman gave a small, knowing smile, the same one he had given Jason before the audition, and in that moment Jason realized he had made the biggest mistake of his career. Jason had walked into that audition convinced he was untouchable, but now he wasn't sure if he'd ever recover from what just happened. Jason stood there, his breath shallow, his confidence shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The silence in the room stretched out uncomfortably, filling every corner of the space like a thick, suffocating fog. His entire body felt rigid, his mind racing for a way to recover, but there was none. The audition was over and he had failed spectacularly. He could feel it in the room, the disappointment, the secondhand embarrassment radiating from the casting panel. He could see James Horner's unimpressed expression, the way Olivia Reed scribbled something on her notepad without even looking up, and worst of all, Morgan Freeman's gaze. It wasn't cruel, It wasn't mocking. It was just knowing, like he had seen this exact scenario play out before, like he had watched young actors trip over their own arrogance and fall face first into failure more times than he could count. Jason hated it. He wanted to break the silence, to say something, anything, to prove he wasn't some foolish, overconfident kid who had just torched his own career. But his throat felt like it was closing up. His mind, usually sharp and quick-witted, was blank. For the first time in his life, Jason Cole had no words. Jason had spent years perfecting his public persona, the confident young actor who always had a comeback, always knew exactly what to say, and never let anyone see his weaknesses. But here, in this room, with these people, he was exposed. The realization hit him like a gut punch. He had spent so much time believing in his own hype that he had never truly prepared for failure. And now, it had found him. Loud, public, unforgiving. His legs felt heavy as he shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his humiliation pressing down on him like an anchor. James Horner let out a slow sigh, finally breaking the silence. "Thank you, Jason," he said, his voice polite but utterly disinterested. Jason flinched. "That was it? Just thank you. No second chances? No try again?" His pulse pounded in his ears as he opened his mouth, desperate to salvage something from this disaster. I think I can do better," he blurted out. The words felt pathetic even as he said them. Horner raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Olivia Reed barely acknowledged him. And then Freeman leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him, his gaze still steady. "Better?" he repeated. Jason's stomach twisted. There was something in Freeman's tone, something calm yet unshakably firm, that made Jason feel like he was standing on trial. "Better how?" Freeman asked. Jason swallowed. I just got in my head. I know I can deliver the scene with more depth, more emotion." Freeman nodded slowly, like he was considering Jason's words. Then he said, "Is that what happened? Or did you realize that confidence alone isn't enough?" Jason's face burned, his hands clenched at his sides. Because you walked into this room thinking you already owned it." Freeman continued smoothly. Jason's breath caught. "You assumed this role was already yours." Silence. "And when the moment came to prove yourself," Freeman added, his voice quiet but piercing, "you had nothing to offer but arrogance." Jason felt like the floor had just dropped out from under him. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred slightly at the edges. Because he was right. Freeman wasn't mocking him. He wasn't humiliating him just for the sake of it. He was simply stating the truth, and Jason had no defense. The silence stretched again. Jason wished he could disappear into it. He had thought that the worst part of today would be forgetting his lines. He was wrong. The worst part was realizing that he had done this to himself. No one in this room had sabotaged him. No one had set him up to fail. No one had tripped him. Jason Cole had walked into this audition unprepared, overconfident, and convinced he was better than everyone else. And now he was paying the price. Freeman studied him for a moment longer before finally sitting back. "Son," he said, his voice quieter now, almost sympathetic, "you think this business is about talent, and it is. But talent means nothing without character." Jason's chest tightened. There are 1,000 actors just like you, good-looking, ambitious, talented, but the ones who last? The ones who leave a mark? Freeman tilted his head slightly. They're the ones who understand that respect isn't just something you demand, it's something you earn. The weight of those words settled onto Jason's shoulders like a lead blanket. He had spent years trying to convince the world that he was special. But in this moment, sitting in front of one of the greatest actors of all time, Jason felt like nothing at all. The audition ended. Jason barely remembered walking out of the room. His legs moved, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. When he stepped back into the waiting room, every eye was on him. Some actors looked sympathetic. Others smirked, sensing that something had gone horribly wrong for him. The young actress who had recognized Freeman earlier watched Jason carefully, as if studying his expression. He felt like everyone could see through him now, like they all knew. Jason sat down in the chair he had occupied before the audition, his hands trembling slightly. His friends, the same ones who had laughed with him earlier, the ones who had encouraged his arrogance, sat in awkward silence. No one made eye contact. No one wanted to ask what had happened. And Jason, he didn't want to say it out loud, because that would make it real. Instead, he sat there staring at the ground, replaying every single mistake he had made. By the next morning, Jason's embarrassment was the least of his problems. Because word had spread. Hollywood had heard about what had happened in that audition room. And just like that, Jason Cole's rising career had just hit a wall before it even began. Jason sat motionless in the waiting room, his fingers curled into fists on his lap. His mind replayed every moment of the audition, each mistake sharper, each misstep louder in his head. The forgotten lines, the stammering, the unbearable silence after his performance fell apart. And above all else, Morgan Freeman's words still echoing in his mind. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. For the first time in his career, his entire life, really, Jason Cole had been forced to confront something he had always ignored. Talent alone wasn't enough, and now he was realizing that he had earned nothing. The waiting room was still crowded with actors, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone knew. Even the ones who hadn't witnessed the disaster firsthand could feel it. Jason could see it in their expressions, the stolen glances, the barely concealed smirks, the silent, awkward tension as the other actors avoided meeting his eyes, unsure whether to feel sorry for him or relish in the moment. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, but then another, and another. Like a slow-moving ripple turning into a crashing wave. Did you hear what happened? He totally bombed in front of Morgan Freeman. Freeman called him out. Right there, in front of everyone. You mean the guy who was making fun of him before the audition? That Jason? Jason's stomach tightened into knots. They knew. They all knew. It wasn't just the humiliation of failing in front of the casting panel. It was the fact that he had done it after openly mocking a Hollywood legend. This wasn't just an audition gone wrong. This was a career-ending moment. Jason felt the panic creeping in, but he forced himself to sit still. He could fix this. He just needed to think. He needed a plan. He could spin it. He could recover. Maybe he could. Jason. A voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. Jason looked up. It was his agent, and her face told him everything he needed to know. What the hell happened in there? His agent's voice was low, sharp, furious. Jason had never heard her sound like that before. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. Number, don't talk. Just listen. She grabbed his arm, pulling him aside into a quieter hallway. I just got off the phone with production. They're not moving forward with you. Jason's breath caught in his throat. What? No, that can't. Jason? Her tone was flat, final. It's done. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Jason shook his head, disbelieving. No, come on. They have to give me another shot. It was just nerves. I can do better. His agent exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Jason, you didn't just screw up the audition. You insulted Morgan Freeman before walking into a room where he was a casting judge. Jason felt his skin go cold. I didn't know who he was, he muttered, voice weak. And that makes it better? Silence. Jason's hands curled into fists. So what? I lose one audition? Fine. There are other roles. His agent sighed. Jason, it's not just this audition. His chest tightened. What do you mean? She hesitated. Then, people talk. Jason froze. His agent's voice was softer now, but it carried a heavy finality. Hollywood is small, Jason, and right now the story spreading is that you're arrogant, that you're disrespectful, that you made a fool of yourself in front of a legend. Jason's heartbeat thundered in his ears. They'll forget. It'll blow over. His agent shook her head. Not this time. By the time Jason left the casting studio, the damage had already spread beyond his control. Social media was already buzzing. Anonymous insiders had leaked the story to entertainment blogs. A viral tweet read, "Up-and-coming actor publicly mocks Morgan Freeman at audition, then bombs in front of him. Career suicide in real time." The comment section exploded. Arrogance always finds a way to destroy itself. Imagine thinking you're too important to show respect, then learning the hard way. He deserves this. You don't disrespect a legend and expect to walk away clean. Within hours, Jason started getting calls. Studios hesitated. Projects he was supposed to be on the short list for, gone. Directors who had shown interest, suddenly unavailable. His career, the one he had barely started, was now unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. 3 weeks later, Jason found himself at an industry event he almost skipped. His agent had convinced him to go, telling him he needed to show his face, prove he wasn't hiding, act like nothing had changed. Except, everything had changed. He wasn't getting the same eager handshakes, the same enthusiastic introductions. People still recognized him, just not in the way he wanted. Then, as he grabbed a drink from the bar, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Good to see you still standing, Jason." Jason turned slowly, and there he was, Morgan Freeman, dressed in a sleek black suit, a quiet air of wisdom surrounding him as effortlessly as ever. Jason swallowed hard. "Mr. Freeman, no need for an apology, son." Jason blinked. "There's not." Freeman smiled. "You've already given me one." Jason frowned. "But I never—" Freeman leaned in slightly. "Oh, but you did." Jason's breath caught. Freeman let out a soft chuckle. "See, Jason, there are two ways people learn in this industry. The easy way and the way you did." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. Freeman's eyes softened. "If you're lucky, this won't be the end of your career, but it will be the moment that defines it." A long pause. "So tell me, Jason." Freeman tilted his head. "How do you want to be remembered?" Jason had no answer, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. The road to redemption or the end of the line? Jason thought he had the industry figured out. He thought he was untouchable. But now, standing there, staring at the man he had once mocked without a second thought, Jason realized this wasn't just about one bad audition, this was about who he was and who he would become. Jason stood frozen, staring at Morgan Freeman, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an unbearable force. Just weeks ago, he had walked into that audition room believing he was untouchable. Now, he wasn't sure if he'd ever recover from what had happened. Morgan Freeman's words had cut deeper than any rejection ever could. Not because they were cruel. Freeman had never raised his voice, never mocked him, never humiliated him. But because they were true. Jason had spent his entire career assuming talent alone would carry him to the top. That confidence, arrogance even, was the key to making it in Hollywood. But in that single, excruciating moment, he realized the truth. Character mattered more than talent, and Jason had none to offer. Studios had pulled back. Directors had taken his name off their lists. His phone, once buzzing with potential opportunities, was silent. The industry wasn't just about who could act, but about who could be trusted, respected, and valued on and off set. And Jason had proven that he was none of those things. Standing in front of Morgan Freeman now, at an event where no one rushed to shake his hand anymore, Jason could only manage a whisper. "I was wrong." Freeman studied him for a long moment, then smiled. A small, almost knowing smile. "Yes," he said. "You were." He let the words hang between them, then patted Jason lightly on the shoulder before turning to walk away. And Jason stood there watching him go, knowing that he had just been given the most important lesson of his life. The only question left was, what would he do with it? Through this story, we realize that talent may open doors, but character is what keeps them open. Jason believed that arrogance was a shortcut to success, but respect, true respect, is not given based on fame or confidence. It is earned through humility, kindness, and the way we treat others when we think no one important is watching. Because in the end, it is not talent that defines us. It is who we choose to be.